From a homemade guitar built out of fireplace wood, Brian May went on to create an empire queen, one of the most legendary bands in rock history, with timeless anthems like We Will Rock You and The Show Must Go On, with a net worth of over $210 million and millions of records sold. He became an enduring icon in the world of rock. But the price of glory was never cheap. Over the years, Brian faced criticism for exploiting Queen's legacy through touring. He narrowly survived a heart attack, and yet, through it all, he never backed down. The way he got back up quietly, with steady resilience, might just surprise you. This is the journey from a self-made guitar to a multi-million-dollar legacy, and the hidden struggles behind one of the most soft-spoken men in rock. If you enjoy videos like this, please remember to hit the like button. It helps us more than you know. And feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. In a post-war London covered in dust and ash, a young boy named Brian May built a guitar with his father using fireplace wood and household scraps because they couldn't afford a real one. They called it the Red Special, a guitar they thought might only play a few chords in the living room. No one imagined it would one day ring out before millions and become the sound of a legend named Queen. London in the 1950s still bore the scars of war-charred brick walls, patchwork rooftops, and a gray sky that seemed to hang heavy over everything. The May family lived in a modest home in Hampton, on the city's west side. They counted every coin for meals, every sheet of carbon paper for schoolwork. In that bleak landscape, Brian, born July 19, 1947, would spend hours staring at the glossy guitars in music catalogs. A Fender Stratocaster cost nearly a month of his father's wages, and every time he turned the page, he closed his eyes and imagined his fingers dancing across the strings. He imagined sound filling a stage somewhere where no one laughed, no one was poor, and no one was forgotten. His father, Harold, an aircraft technician, was often exhausted, addicted to cigarettes, worn down by life, but still, he found time to do something extraordinary with his son: build a guitar from scraps around the house. They worked late into the night, failing often, but refusing to quit. They had no blueprint, just patience and persistence. When the Red Special made its first distorted sound, Brian froze. Was his dream going to fall apart over a loose screw? A faulty string? But they didn't give up. And then, in 1963, Brian stepped onto his first stage inside a small boat club in Molesey. His heart pounded under the dim lights. A few dozen people sat below, sipping pale beer. When the Red Special rang out its first note, the room went silent. Then, a voice called out, "Kid, where did that guitar come from?" Brian lowered his head and smiled. No one knew it had been born from a broken fireplace and long, cold winter nights. Brian Harold May, the only son of Harold and Ruth May, grew up in a London that had yet to recover from war. He had no money, no connections, only a handmade guitar and a dream that refused to die. And that very dream would one day open doors that once seemed out of reach, the doors that led to Queen. At one point, Brian May stood between two worlds, the laboratory or the stage. He chose to leave the lecture halls behind, touring in a battered van with a struggling band, playing to near-empty bars. But from those nights when no one was listening, something remarkable began to take root, and Freddie Mercury was the spark that lit the flame. In the late 1960s, while the world was still captivated by the space race, Brian May, then a physics graduate from Imperial College, closed his books. He walked away from a future in research to follow music, while his friends moved on to classrooms and laboratories. Alongside drummer Roger Taylor, Brian formed a band called Smile, but the group quickly dissolved when lead singer Tim Staffel left. That's when Freddie Mercury appeared, bold, unconventional, and full of belief in something no one else could see. During one rehearsal, Freddie looked Brian in the eye and said, "You've got that guitar, I've got this voice, we're going to make the world remember us." And just like that, Queen was born. But their road to the stage wasn't paved with spotlight and glamour. They slept in the backs of cold vans, strummed their instruments in tiny bars with just a handful of people in the room. At one show, only 3 people showed up, and Brian couldn't help but wonder, did I make a mistake giving up my PhD? Then, in 1975, they did something no one expected. In an era dominated by bands like Led Zeppelin and The Who, Queen released a 6-minute track, no chorus, no traditional structure. Bohemian Rhapsody was rejected by many radio stations, but once it aired, Audiences across Europe were swept into an emotional storm unlike anything they'd heard before. Queen exploded from a barroom phenomenon to the heart of pop culture. Their defining moment came on July 13, 1985 at Live Aid, the largest concert event in history, held for charity, in front of 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium, and over 1 billion watching worldwide. Brian stepped onto the stage, holding his red special. When he struck the first notes of We Will Rock You, the stadium erupted. It wasn't just music, it was the anthem of a generation. From a handmade guitar and empty gigs, Brian May carved his place in music history not by luck, but by believing in a sound the world hadn't yet heard. But even the brightest stage lights couldn't chase away all the darkness. Because soon after Live Aid, the biggest storms of Brian's life began to form quietly, persistently. And they didn't come from the stage, they came from within. When the stage lights began to dim after Queen's peak years, what surprised many was that Brian May wasn't left behind. In fact, he entered a new chapter 1 where success was no longer measured by record sales, but by the enduring power of every note he had ever written. From the intricate layers of the Prophet's Song to the iconic riffs of Tie Your Mother Down and Fat-Bottomed Girls, Brian's touch in each composition remains irreplaceable. And as Queen continues touring with Adam Lambert, those very songs remain the heart of every concert. Voices may change, but the red special is still there, and Brian still keeps time for both memory and the moment. With over 50 years in music, Brian hasn't simply lived off fame, he's lived through ownership. As a co-founder and co-writer of most of Queen's catalog, royalties alone have helped his net worth exceed $210 million. And he's done it without chasing trends, without crowding the spotlight. What sets Brian apart most is this: despite the wealth to live as lavishly as anyone, he's never been drawn to showmanship. To him, real success isn't in the numbers, it's in whether you can live quietly in a world that never stops shouting. And that's why the places he chooses to live, his homes, his rooms, his gardens, reveal more about him than any interview ever could. For someone who never chased the spotlight, home is the one place allowed to be still. And that's how Brian May has lived through more than half a century in music, choosing homes that don't demand admiration, only honesty. Tucked into the historic district of Kensington, where artists, statesmen, and British nobility once lived. Brian's primary London townhouse is valued at over £10 million, around $12.5 million, covered in ivy, with a Georgian-style red brick facade and arched windows. It bears no nameplate, no glaring cameras, just a small iron gate that opens only to the familiar. Inside lies another world, a quiet museum of his own making. Black and white photos of Freddie, yellowed handwritten sheet music, a model of Mars, and an antique telescope perched by the attic window on the ground floor. A music room red special rests behind glass, surrounded by vintage analog amps. None of it is flashy, but everything has a story. When not in London, Brian retreats to his second home in Surrey, about an hour's drive from the city. This countryside estate sits on over 2 acres, with an outdoor pool, a greenhouse, and a modest recording studio, valued between £4, $5 million, roughly $6 million. Its real worth lies far beyond market value. At Surrey, he spends mornings walking the garden, tending wildflowers, and something few people know, feeding wild foxes at dawn. Locals say they often see him in an old wool coat, gently pouring water into a porcelain bowl beneath the apple tree. No one bothers him. It's a familiar sight, not a rock star, but a man rediscovering what it means to simply be alive. There are also quiet rumors of a small property in western England, near Bristol, where Brian occasionally escapes to write in solitude, though never publicly confirmed. Paparazzi have once captured him near an old stone cottage with a steep, mossy roof. If true, it fits the pattern: understated, withdrawn, and more like the home of a philosopher than a rock icon. For others, real estate is a statement, but for Brian May, every house reflects the one thing he's never compromised: living honestly, in peace, and on his own terms. If his homes are where he returns to reflect, his cars are how he quietly leaves the world behind. No noise, no flashy supercars, just soulful machines from a time when speed wasn't everything character was. His most beloved is a deep red 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera worth about $120,000 today. But for Brian, its value isn't financial. This is the car he once drove across Europe in Queen's early touring days, including a sleepless ride from Berlin to Paris after a sold-out show. The steering's slightly off. The leather seats are worn, but the engine still hums like an unspoken overture. Next to it is a smoke silver 1958 Porsche 356 Speedster, an open-top classic valued at over $400,000 today. No air conditioning, no power steering, just a wheel, a manual gearbox, and wind slicing through the low windshield. Brian often drives it on early weekend mornings through Surrey's winding roads, when the grass is still wet with fog and no one knows where he's going. Among the most iconic in his collection is a silver-gray 1969 Aston Martin DB6, a true gentleman of the vintage car world, now worth between $350,000 and $450,000. It was a gift to himself after the final Magic Tour with Freddie Mercury, a reminder of both their peak and the fragile nature of fame. And then there's the black 1971 Mercedes-Benz 280 SE valued at around $80,000. Once a symbol of quiet sophistication in Europe's artistic circles. It's not fast, not loud, but stable and timeless. Brian uses it for formal occasions, Freddie's memorial, charity events, or evenings performing classical pieces with full orchestras. In the world of rock and roll, few live like Brian May. No late-night parties, no hard liquor, no lavish indulgences. His lifestyle goes against every cliché of the genre, and that's precisely what makes him remarkable. Brian has been a full vegetarian for years, not as a trend, but out of deep respect for life, from the foxes in his backyard to the wildflowers by his gate. His mornings begin with a cup of black tea, a slice of toasted rye bread, and a spoonful of oats. No private chef, no special menu. He brews the tea himself, clears the dishes himself, and starts the day with soft classical music playing in the background. His exercise routine isn't for display. He doesn't run marathons or post from a gym. Instead, he walks the forests of Surrey, reads by tree trunks, or strums his guitar unplugged in the garden. That quiet rhythm helped him recover from a heart attack in 2020, a health scare that nearly took his life at 73. When not composing, Brian devotes time to astronomy, a passion he's held since childhood. His study is lined with Hubble telescope prints, a hand-labeled model of the solar system, and star charts filled with personal notes. He still follows planetary movements, writes blog posts for science communities, and occasionally appears at conferences as an astrophysicist. His spending reflects that same grounded lifestyle: no luxury watches, no brand endorsements on social media, no chasing the latest gadgets. He uses film cameras, collects CDs, and still listens to music on vinyl, not out of nostalgia, but because it helps him feel truly alive. In a world that moves faster every day, Brian May chooses to live like a long symphony, not rushing to the climax, only making sure each note lands with purpose. And perhaps that very rhythm, steady, thoughtful, deliberate, is what's helped him preserve the most meaningful relationships in his life. Behind the grand career, Brian May lives quietly among relationships that require no performance. His first marriage, to Christine Mullen, the mother of his 3 children, James, Louisa, and Emily, ended quietly in 1988. During those years, he kept his family out of the spotlight, allowing his children to grow up in privacy like any others. It was during that period he met Anita Dobson, the woman who remains by his side to this day. No fanfare, no grand promises, just the quiet presence of a partner for over 3 decades. They married in 2000 and have walked together since, calm and constant in a world too loud for most love to endure. Brian rarely speaks about family, but once he said this: "It's the only place I can set the guitar down and know no one will judge me." Even legends can feel the weight of the spotlight. What nearly brought Brian May to his knees, success never shielded him from the scars that cut deeper than any guitar note he ever played. In the late 1980s, while Queen was still at the height of fame, Brian was quietly enduring 3 devastating blows: the collapse of his marriage, the sudden death of his father, and growing tensions within the band itself. But the greatest loss came in 1991 when Freddie Mercury passed away. It wasn't just the voice of Queen that was gone, it was part of its soul. Brian fell into a deep depression. He once wrote that he had no reason to get out of bed in the morning. His only escape was through music. Writing became a form of healing. His solo album, Back to the Light, 1992, emerged from that darkness. It wasn't made to top charts, it was made to help him stay on his feet. Though it never became a major commercial success, for Brian, it was a quiet resurrection. But the storms didn't all come from within. When Brian publicly opposed the UK government's badger culling program meant to control bovine tuberculosis, he was met with harsh criticism, calling it unethical and scientifically unsound. He became a target for politicians and farmers alike. The press labeled him a romantic who idealizes wildlife. And at one point, agricultural journals launched coordinated attacks against him. But Brian stood his ground. He founded the Save Me Trust and continued his advocacy for animal welfare across the UK. Then came another wave of backlash, this time from longtime fans, when Queen began touring with Adam Lambert. Many accused him of cashing in on Freddie's name. One journalist even asked him directly, "Do you really think you still have the right to call this band?" Brian replied softly, "We're not replacing Freddie. We're keeping his light alive." Still, those harsh words left their mark. And then, in 2020, everything went quiet. Brian suffered a heart attack while gardening. 3 arteries were blocked. He was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery to place 3 stents, his life hanging in the balance. When he regained consciousness, his first thoughts weren't about music or the stage. He remembered only one thing: Anita was holding his hand the whole time. It wasn't the roar of stadiums, but the silence between life and death that reminded him what truly matters: being here, to keep loving, to keep writing, to keep living. And from those moments when everything nearly slipped away, Brian May's legacy began to grow beyond music. What does a man leave behind when he's lived for music, science, and compassion? At an age when most people have slowed down, Brian May still writes music, still walks onto the stage, and still looks up at the stars just like the boy from Hampton once did. But what he leaves behind isn't just millions of records or sold-out concert nights. It's a quiet reminder a true artist never stops at the spotlight. In 2007, he completed his PhD in astrophysics after more than 30 years of delay. By 2008, he was appointed Chancellor at Liverpool John Moores University, where he's inspired an entire generation of students who chose a path outside the traditional mold. For Brian, exploring the universe and composing music are both journeys in search of beauty, just set at different distances. But perhaps the most beautiful things are the ones he does quietly. Since 2009, the Save Me Trust, his wildlife charity, has helped protect thousands of animals from hunting and cruelty. He's also supported environmental education programs, community initiatives, and small science projects, quietly funding them behind the scenes, simply to preserve a little hope in an increasingly noisy world. His name is etched in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 2001, honored with a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award 2018, and he was made a CBE by Queen Elizabeth II. But what people often remember most is the image of Brian setting down his red special to gently hold a lost fox in his garden. At 77, Brian still performs with Queen plus Adam Lambert. He has nothing left to prove. He does it to keep the fire alive for Freddie, for the fans, and for himself. From a guitar built out of fireplace wood and old screws to a legacy of music, science, and kindness, Brian May leaves behind something far greater: the inspiration to live meaningfully. Brian May reminds us that no dream is too small if you believe in it long enough, that even with nothing but your hands, you can compose a symphony of your own, slow, beautiful, and true to who you are. If Brian's story made you reflect on your own path, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if you still believe in quiet, meaningful things, don't forget to subscribe and help us spread the inspiration.